Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Thank you for listening to this St. Louis on the Air podcast brought to you by Lindenwood University's Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise, examining market approaches to help solve economic and social issues, hammond.institute.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. We can always find moments in history that changed it for better or worse. Next Sunday and Monday, the History Channel is presenting a two-part series that make the point. It's titled Presidents at War and broadly tells the stories of how war shaped and changed 8 men who ultimately became president. The presidents are Dwight Eisenhower, JFK, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and George H.W. Bush. Joining me from Annapolis is military historian John McManus. He's a resident of Baldwin, professor of history at Missouri S&T, and the author of 13 books primarily on World War II. He is heavily involved in the History Channel production with his focus primarily on Dwight Eisenhower. John, nice to talk to you again.
Hey, Don. Great to be with you.
What are you doing in Annapolis?
Well, I'm here on a one-year distinguished visiting professorship. It's called the Leo A. Schifrin Chair, and I'm teaching American military history and World War II and history of Americans in ground combat to the midshipmen.
I envy you being in Annapolis. It's one of my favorite little towns.
It's a great town. I really like it.
It really is. Looking forward, to the History Channel production coming up next week, John. But let's get right to it. You're focusing primarily on Dwight Eisenhower, and I think it's important as we start this conversation to let people know that it wasn't all about D-Day with Ike. He had some misses along with that big hit.
Absolutely. It was a work in progress for him. I mean, he starts out the war basically, in D.C., in the Pentagon, in the War Plans Division, kind of just like planning grand strategy. And that's sort of a trial balloon that his boss, George Marshall, uses to see if maybe he thinks he would be ready for Ike for strategic command. So he gets the invasion of North Africa, which was so politically problematic because you're dealing with the Vichy French, you're dealing with local nationalists, a little bit of tinge of Axis influence, and then, of course, trying to keep the Allied coalition together was just enough of a job in and of itself. So Eisenhower deals with all sorts of crises in the Mediterranean. So really, by the time of D-Day, he's kind of an experienced operator who's learned some lessons and taken some hard lumps.
But early on, there was the word humiliation was used, if I recall correctly, in terms of some of the African campaign that were very unsuccessful for him.
Yeah, and most notably the counterattack that Rommel launches around this time of year, mid-February 1943, primarily against the American lines. And he drives about a 14-mile wedge in the American lines. He captures thousands of U.S. prisoners, and this was humiliating in the sense that it showed that the Americans were not quite ready for prime time. They would in time, and Eisenhower learns a tremendous number of lessons from this, but it was not, a particularly auspicious beginning.
How does a commander survive something like that?
I think he survives it because he's already taking action even by the end of it, and he helps turn it around. One of the things we tend to forget about the battle we often call Kasserine Pass is how reactive Eisenhower and some of his key subordinates were in turning the thing around, and they regain the lost ground. They basically win a strategic victory ultimately, though you wouldn't have known it within the first 1 week or so. So I think that's one of the reasons why he does survive. And already by then, I think it's fair to say that he had consummated and established good relationships with key decision makers from the various Western countries. And of course, most notably, the political figures like Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had some confidence in him. And on the American military side, his boss, General George Marshall, had confidence. And they knew that this was going to be a tough war in which you're going to have some reverses. So the standards, the kind of thinking is a little bit different than the sort of zero defect viewpoint that later generations will have for military operations.
How do you think all of this informed his presidency?
Oh, I think that Eisenhower had a very keen sense of America's emerging position in the world, but that as powerful as the United States was becoming and was going to be, that it needed, in fact, what was vital to American security and to what he thought was the human future was the establishment of strong, impervious alliances. And in that sense, he's primarily thinking about the European partners like Britain and France and Italy, post Mussolini, of course. He's thinking about Europe, but of course, as his presidency unfolds, events in Asia are really setting much the tone. And so obviously he didn't have firsthand experience in the Asia Pacific War, but I think his experiences in Europe taught him that lesson that the United States needed allies in order to extend its influence. And I think that he also had a kind of a toleration for other points of view and a kind of embracing of healthy debate, because he had seen how this kind of honest leadership environment could lead to good results during the war.
I wonder what he'd be thinking with regard to our relationship with many of our allies today.
I tend to think he'd be pretty distressed by it, because he is such a diplomatic person in so many ways. I think that he feels that 5 to 10 minutes of good, earnest, honest conversation can lead to the establishment of a very strong relationship that pays dividends for maybe years down the line, and trust. And I think that he would probably be a little bit vexed by the idea of the United States turning back inward, because if there was one thing that Eisenhower certainly was, it was an internationalist, kind of post-Wilson internationalist who sees the United States as the key player in the world, and that bad things happen when the U.S. doesn't play that role.
I think when we think of Dwight Eisenhower, we might not necessarily think of him as an intellectual. Would you say that he was?
Well, I definitely think he was. I mean, from my standpoint as a military historian, there's no question he's a military intellectual. I mean, he graduated, for instance, first in his class at the General Staff and Command College at Fort Leavenworth, and that was no mean feat. I mean, that you had intense competition, and you're not going to do that unless certainly you're very committed and you have a kind of an intellect that perhaps separates you a little bit. So I think that during his presidency, and maybe the first 20 years or so after that, there was a sense of this kind of bumbling old uncle with his sort of butchered syntax and all of this kind of stuff. But I think now the consensus has emerged among many of his biographers, and certainly among military historians like me, that Eisenhower really did have a first-rate intellect, and that's part of why he ends up as a pretty successful leader in a lot of ways.
And he certainly was prescient in certain ways. His farewell address with regard to the military-industrial complex was right on the money, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's the irony of the whole thing. I mean, here is a man who has spent his entire adult life in military circles, in the Army, actually. And of course, his defense and security policy as president really centers around air power, more so than anything else, at the minimization of ground power. So that was ironic, too. And then at the end of his presidency, he says, hey, we got to watch out for the military industrial complex, which is really, in a way, a byproduct of the internationalist America that he most advocated. And so I think if he were, it's only my opinion, but if he were sort of speaking with us candidly immediately after his presidency, one of the disappointments he would probably tell us is that he hadn't ended the Cold War. He hadn't really diffused that tension. And that both sides were building missiles, and the tension was amping up, of course, in Southeast Asia and other hotspots, and he had wanted to quell that.
Well, of course, the Cold War did end with one of the other presidents that are cited in the History Channel series. But before we get to George H.W. Bush and some of the others, tell us exactly what your role has been with the production of this series.
Right. So I've been in touch with them. I guess they first got in touch with me a little over a year ago. And we began a series of conversations about the experiences of the various presidents. And of course, they're keenly interested. And I think this is a great topic that they wanted to know how their wartime experiences shaped them as leaders, shaped their presidencies ultimately, or whether it had any effect or not. And I've felt for years that with all of them, that World War II was a formative event, particularly, of course, obviously for Eisenhower. So we discussed that first, and then I sat for a series of interviews to participate in the documentary. And if I'm remembering correctly, I mean, we focused in my case primarily on Eisenhower, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan as well. And again, there was that kind of overarching theme of what happened to these guys in World War II. Explain to us the context, and then maybe we can venture forward and see how, their experiences and what happened to them, really did affect their decision making as presidents. And I just think it's a fascinating thing to come to grips with.
Was there any discussion, I know this is all focusing on World War II, but was there any discussion about Harry Truman and his role in World War I, particularly given the role he played in ending World War II?
From my vantage point, there wasn't. Maybe they spoke with other scholars about that. I don't know. But it's a fascinating topic, too, and an important one. And there's no question that Truman's World War I experience, is seminal in shaping him and his decisions at the end of World War II and thereafter. But we did not really get into that in much depth. Then post interviews, too, the other thing is I did quite a bit of consulting with them, too, about the script, and they would bounce questions off me and that kind of thing, too. So it was a fun project because we could, kind of see, what you could focus on and not, because it's such a huge body of material you could cover, but they need to distill it for 2 nights of programming. But I think it's really the final product looks like it's going to be a pretty interesting thing to watch.
Well, certainly looking forward to it. It's pretty clear that history certainly would have been changed had JFK and Lyndon Johnson and Bush 41 not been pretty lucky during World War II. They were lucky to survive it.
They really were. In Johnson's case, it's such a quixotic moment because he had gone to the South Pacific. As you know, of course, he was already a congressman. He leaves Congress to join the Navy, and he's really just not doing much of anything tangible, but he knows he needs to get into a combat zone for his political career. This is classic Johnson. He's such a political animal and so self-centered. And so he gets to the South Pacific, to Southwest Pacific area, to MacArthur's command, and he arranges to participate, to basically go along as an observer on a medium bomber mission in New Guinea. And he was assigned onto one plane that he was about to get onto, but he had to use the restroom. And by the time he came back, someone else was in his seat, so he went on a different plane. Well, it turned out the original plane that he was supposed to fly on was the one that got shot down on the mission. So, if Johnson had not had to answer the call of nature at that moment, obviously history would have been dramatically different. Just one of those odd little quirks.
Yeah, and you're right. That absolutely is quintessential LBJ. Just a story like that. I was surprised in reading over some material from the series, John, that JFK, I know he was a hero. The PT-109 story is well told, but I hadn't been really as up to date as I should have been on how heroic he was during that incident. I mean, swimming with the kind of the bit in between his teeth, helping one of his crewmates survive that incident. Really quite a heroic effort.
Absolutely remarkable. And this is a guy who, has grown up basically with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth, and yet at this moment of crisis, he's really thinking of not himself, but everybody else, exactly as an officer is supposed to in this enormous crisis. And the other thing too that's interesting about it, there's no question he was a hero, doing major acts that could get you highly decorated, but he's not really thinking about it politically in the aftermath too. He's more ashamed in a way to have lost his boat. And not that he did anything that terrible, but he's not really thinking about self-promotion at all. It's the sort of Kennedy political machine that comes along later and, realizes the political gold you would get out of PT-109. John Kennedy did not really want to trumpet that in the aftermath. He was really quite an anonymous PT boat captain, even after that happened. But his guys knew what he had done.
We were talking with military historian John McManus, who was a part of a History Channel presentation coming up this weekend called Presidents at War. How is the Kennedy thing going to be presented during this series? Do we have any video, any film, any authentic stuff that they can work into this series?
Unfortunately, I don't think I can answer that fairly because I was not involved at all with the Kennedy side of it. I was curious enough to ask them about it because obviously PT-109 is so well known. I wondered if there was something new. And they said, yeah, we think we're going to be able to get some new accounts, of people who were there or how he was affected by it. And so I thought that sounds very interesting. I think they were focusing with Robert Dallek in particular, who was one of Kennedy's biographers, on the PT 109 incident.
So many of us were reacquainted with the video they do have of George H.W. Bush's rescue in the Pacific during World War II. Very dramatic stuff. And that, too, had to have some impact on that man as he moved on through the many posts that he had, including the presidency.
Dramatic impact. I mean, this was one of the youngest naval aviators in the Navy at that point. He lost his two crewmen that time he was shot down. And it's something that, of course, never left him. That sense of leadership as obligation, as service, of thinking of others first. I think it's fair to say George H.W. Bush was sort of hot-wired that way throughout a lot of his life. And there's no question, too, that he was one of the things that really stayed with him was the finality and seriousness of war. I think he took that very seriously throughout his entire life. And you really see it later on during the Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf War, when he has an opportunity to stop hostilities on February 28, 1991, with the goal accomplished of removing Saddam's army from Kuwait. He immediately stops right then. He doesn't want another life lost from hanging on to hostilities for even an hour too long.
I wonder if Eisenhower would have done the same thing.
Eisenhower, I think, probably would have thought it a little more broadly and strategically. But I think that in the end, he probably would have ended up in much the same place, but maybe a day or two later. Because what Eisenhower would have been quite conscious of is keeping the coalition together. And of course, if you decide you're going to reroute the mission and go to Baghdad or whatever else, now you're into a completely different animal that would have, fractured the coalition. But it's interesting to speculate.
Yeah, particularly if he had had a George Patton with him, what he might have done.
Right.
Yeah, they would have gone right through, no doubt. You don't often think of Ronald Reagan in connection with World War II. I mean, he was a movie star, and a lot of movie stars served, but they served, for the most part, fairly comfortably.
And he did, too, as it turned out, though he didn't want to. Reagan volunteered for combat. He wanted to be deployed overseas, but his eyesight was just absolutely terrible. And he was also, like you said, he was already a movie star. He was older. He was in his 30s. So it's not like he was some 20-year-old kid who would be, more likely to be drafted and do something physical somewhere. But so Reagan, I think that certainly the Army and the Army Air Force at the time felt he would be more useful to the war effort in the realm of communication as to how to buck up morale, how to gather information, how to use film in order to train crews. I mean, Reagan did a heck of a lot of work on this, and he was very proud of his service because he really had nothing to be ashamed of. He tried very hard to get deployed. They wouldn't do it, and so he did what they would allow him to do. And I don't think there's any question but that it affected him.
I wonder if he brought anything from that experience to the presidency.
I personally think he did. Again, this growing sense of American power and American importance, and in Reagan's case, what he would have thought of as, a kind of American exceptionalism. So the war to him meant American destruction of tyrannical empires, and that was America's new role in the world. And as he started to change politically after the war, because you probably know he was very much a hardcore Democrat, a union leader, but he felt that communism had kind of changed the game and changed the equation. So he becomes obviously an ardent anti-communist. And so again, there's this sense of mission of America's sort of unique purpose in the world. And I think that World War II is, to some extent, just the foundation of that for him.
How about Jimmy Carter?
Jimmy Carter is too young to have been, deployed overseas, but of course, as we know, he was schooled right here, not far from here, at the U.S. Naval Academy, as really one of the first of the nuclear oriented officers of his generation, of nuclear submarines, eventually nuclear power, and its impact on naval affairs. Jimmy Carter, again, I think that one of the things that's fair to say is the sense of service, the sense of commitment to the larger and greater good. I think he learns all those things here and sees, how this is played out in World War II, and the folks who are older, maybe his TAC officers and whatever else. So I don't think there's any question but that the kind of commitment to service from that era affects him for the rest of his life and in his presidency.
Is there a common thread, a straight line you can draw amongst these 8 presidents in connection with their wartime experience and their presidencies?
I think that if there is one common thread, it is that word I had mentioned a moment ago, service, and that certainly that the armed forces are highly important in the modern presidency to modern America. That Americans have an obligation to serve, and that doesn't necessarily always mean militarily, but it means larger humankind for America's role in securing freedom or whatever. I think that's one thing. You see this kind of straight line from Eisenhower to George H.W. Bush. They all would have kind of agreed with that abstract notion. They might have argued at what that meant. They might have taken it down different paths that some would agree with and others would disagree with, especially in relation to Vietnam, in which Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon are heavily involved, and Ford a little bit too. But I do think that that's kind of the straight line, that they had all had that kind of formative experience of being World War II era Americans. So in that sense, they were all very much creatures of the 20th century.
Very, very quickly here, the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum in Kansas is undergoing renovation. Are you involved with that at all by any chance?
I am not, although I'm going to be there in a couple of weeks to speak about Eisenhower and particularly the parallels between Eisenhower and Grant, which are almost eerie. They're so similar in so many ways, and Eisenhower really kind of sought to emulate Grant. So I'm hoping to maybe get a look firsthand at the ongoing work, provided, of course, that it'll be open, that we don't have a government shutdown.
A subject for another time. John McManus, thank you so much for being with us. Time is up. The History Channel production of Presidents at War is airing at 7 o'clock this coming Sunday and Monday. Thank you again, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me, Don. I appreciate it.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.